Like art? Columbus Public Health and Columbus Landmarks Foundation have partnered to offer free guided tours of the city's Artwalks sites, led by expert historians and guides. It's called Columbus Artwalks and Landmark Talks. Whether you live up the street or are visiting from another city, take a walk while visiting local culture. These unique tours offer a great way to explore the art, history, and architecture of our Columbus neighborhoods. Today's show highlights a recent tour. To find out more about the tours, you can visit columbuslandmarks.org.
I am Doreen Uhas Sauer. I work with Columbus Landmarks Foundation, past president, help with education programs and a number of other things. As you see from your map, if you've, everybody get one? Did you get them? Okay. It's a very extensive walking tour, so we're only going to do a little portion of it. And yes, campus can be very quiet this time of year, except for the overhead planes, because they use Lincoln and Morrill Tower as a lineup for the 17th Avenue runway at the airport. So it's a constant flight pattern that we're this way. We're just going to say we're kind of in a historic spot because this has always been the traditional gateway to the university area. And the gate that most people kind of pass through there was done, actually dedicated in 1941, and it was called the Patriarch's Gate, the Alumni Gate. It's gone by a lot of different names, but it only lasted that way for about 30 years until the 1970s, which saw a lot of unrest on campus, and the idea was to shut down this, which used to be a long street that led right to the oval and the circle. And I don't know how many of you probably remember that. But in the 1970s, everybody seems to have this misnomer that there were a lot of riots that were due to Vietnam, and there were a lot of riots that were due to peace movement. And the truth of the matter is, most of them started because of a jaywalking ticket. Had nothing to do initially with anything to do with the war. A lot of the war demonstrations happened on campus until, of course, it got to be kind of great fun to bait the police. But the worst of the riots were actually over jaywalking tickets. Columbus police pursued them. They would follow you right into buildings. And this was the brainchild of Mayor Sensenbrenner, some of you may remember him, who occasionally would get it in his head that these people on campus need to start acting like responsible adults. And in poor Mayor Sensenbrenner's time, couldn't figure out where students, during times of unrest, he just could not understand that idea, sort of lack of, I guess, civility. But we referenced a building that used to stand here, and some of you may remember the Armory, and it was a beautiful building built in the 1890s. It was a big, giant space, and so graduations were held there. All sorts of athletic events were held there, and it burned in 1958. Absolutely not premeditated, absolutely an accident that it burned down. And this area stood vacant for some time, and the Armory just was never going to be rebuilt. But somebody remembered it, and that was one of the architects, and that was Richard Trott of Columbus. Worked with Peter Eisman from New York, and what he wanted to do was kind of recreate the sense of the Armory. And so that's why you have the towers and you have the lattice work. But are we ready to walk a bit? Because we'll never get walking like the health department wants us to. One of those more iconic buildings. Hayes Hall, known for fine arts, has been a number of things over the years. In fact, in World War I, it was part of the aviation school, and they used to go over to the old student union for their mess hall. So it's transformed in a lot of ways. It is a Yost and Packard building. Packard, again, you've probably heard him a lot on these tours, and you'll hear more about him. Frank Packard was the most remarkable architect who died very early in his career. Firemen's Union, the railroad station building, that was one of his. He did private buildings, he did public buildings. He did the courthouse in Wood County up in Bowling Green, which is unbelievably amazing. And he was in partnership with Yost, who was an older man at the time, and then Packard goes off on his own. But when they designed this, Hayes Hall, The real mark, I think, of a university are the buildings you see that make you think about universities, right? You know, they sort of fall into kind of a scheme here. And they picked Richardson Romanesque. And Richardson was an architect, an older architect than Packard, who had developed this style, and the arches are always prominent in it. This is considered to be one of those whispering arches, where if you stood on that end and you whispered something into the arch and somebody was standing over here, that they supposedly could hear you. Any demonstrations? Anybody want to try? I have no idea if this works or not. What? Okay, you need urine. Okay. I have no idea what this is not staged, and I have no idea what they're whispering. So I think you need to kind of speak into the arch part.
I have to think of something to say. I can hear you.
Anything?
I just can't hear you.
I could hear him. He kept saying, "What'd you say? What'd you say?"
That's usually what I say anyway.
Another example of communication breaking down in a marriage. Actually, Rutherford B. Hayes was president of the university, becomes president of the United States, and so the building is named in his honor. And he actually helped to dedicate the building and had an office in the building. This idea of this kind of, not just the arch, but the columns, the brick columns, and the rusticated stone, where you see there's kind of this lentil that goes across the top, is also part of Richardson Romanesque. And here's another little sort of handy-dandy item. You can almost always tell every building on the oval that built before 1920 because it has a vestibule of some sort. And the idea was that you had to take your shoes off before you went in to class, because generally everything out here was a mud pit. And there were no sidewalks, so you left your shoes in the archway. I assume it was a far safer, more honest character at the time. And then your shoes were there when you came back up, you hope. So as we pass through buildings, you'll see other ones like this. This idea of the oval laid out this way actually becomes part of what the first architect of Ohio State has in his mind, and that's Joseph Bradford, who actually also builds that, building that will become Sullivan Hall after the museum moves out. And what he did was there were only like 1 or 2 access points, and they picked the natural paths that people were walking, and then they paved them over, which made a great deal of sense. But in doing so, you know, if we were flying like a bird over this, we would see that there is a pattern and a rhythm to them, but it's just the natural rhythm of people walking. Right. Yeah, right. It works that way.
So the same architect on the tower over here?
Right. Orton Hall is also a Yost and Packard, probably more Packard than Yost. Yeah. Yeah, this is just one of those buildings that everybody, you know, is kind of drawn to. I think in partly it's the scale of the architecture and just the really nice stonework. Everything that we're kind of talking about today and stopping, except for some of the more delectable little asides, I guess, can be found if you dial a number on your map that corresponds to a little picture, a little icon, and on your phone, when you put in the 3-digit number, it gives you a little narration, about a 1.5-minute narration of where you are. And I think a lot of you have known that from other tours, but in case you're new, thank you for reminding me to say that. Okay, obviously not built before 1920, built shortly after the 20s. Bricker Hall is probably best known because it's an administration building. One of the things that makes it an interesting building is its vast expanse inside. If you've been in, it has a very large foyer, and then all of the offices kind of surround the wall. And it was an early place where faculty used to put on plays. People who lived in the neighborhood or were part of the faculty, this was like their building, especially before the faculty club was built. And so it served as multi-purpose for a lot of things. And then lasted right until the 1970s for some good old-fashioned sit-ins. If people are alumni and they decide to be cremated, they sometimes send their remains to Ohio State to be dealt with. And it's not a big to-do. They may sit around on some secretary's desk for a little while they plan what they're doing, but generally what happens is they are buried, and they're buried right out here. So when I say where the bodies are buried, they're buried under these trees and all through here, and there's no marker. The idea is just simply they wish to be buried at Ohio State, and it seems as though this is a very loving and logical space to be, right? We're going to walk over to U Hall and tell you a little bit about, you know it's not the original one, right? It's 7/8 size of the original. Do any of you remember the original one? Please don't tell me I'm the only one. Oh, thank you, thank you. Okay.
Is Bricker and Eckler?
Yeah,
Okay.
Bricker was president of the university, but he was vice presidential candidate in the 1950s. When I say this is 7/8 size of the original, that's very important because what they had to do is make it level, for in other words, for ADA access and other things like that. So the other one actually stood up on very high steps, and when you went into it, it had been the only building on campus for a long time. So it came in about 1872. The university was founded officially 1870. And so the faculty were housed here, the students were housed here. Of course, we're only talking about a dozen or so. And then the theater, there was a theater in here, an assembly spot, and classrooms and everything. And I do remember it in the same era and had a lot of classes here because the history department kind of held forth here. So when this was created and built, and a lot of students go by here and they go, oh, isn't that wonderful? That's the old building. It's like, no, it's not. But the one thing that is intriguing to me is the very top of it. There is a photostat on the flagpole. And so on a cloudy day, it's supposed to go down in the evening and come up, the flag unfurled, you know, at sunrise. But on a cloudy day, it does this. It'll start, you're across campus and it's like up and down, up and down, up and down, which kind of makes it sort of a neat thing, I guess. That's probably the only charm I can really kind of find about this. This was built in, oh, you're going to ask you to go, the 80s, because the old one came down in the 70s and there was some time there. Let's go over here. How many of you have been in the library since they redid it? A couple of you? This building, the original part of the building, the low part was done in 1911 in a second Renaissance style revival. The upper part was added in 1951 when returning GIs swelled the population of the school. But by already 1911, it had 4 million volumes in it. So this is no small library. So you may have noticed William Oxley Thompson. This is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it was commissioned after he had passed on, and it was a local sculptor who was with the university, Edwin Fry, who did it. And he created this sculpture of William Oxley Thompson, who was such a popular president of the university. And it was dedicated, I think, in 1930. Like a lot of other things around here, it has its own set of traditions. And the tradition was because he was so beloved by the university and by students, and he was also a minister. In fact, he was minister of the Indianola Presbyterian Church at 16th and High. So many of the students he knew personally, many people, there were students who would come to him and say, I can't afford tuition, and he would let it ride. You know, he took this personal interest. And a lot of them came to him and said, will you marry us? And then will you baptize the babies? So he was really part of the community. So the story was that if you started here and you walked together, you know, as a couple, and you walked the entire length of this, what you were walking was a place called the Long Walk. This idea that if you walk this long walk, you would eventually get married. And so I remember being in college where people would walk down, a couple would walk down, and somebody, usually it was the girl, who would remind the guy, you know, if we walk the whole length of this, we'll get married. And then all of a sudden you see the guy turn off his hair, turn off that way. It was really quite remarkable. At the Indianola Presbyterian Church, if you look at the front of it, off to the one side, to the north side, there is a little stone pulpit. And the pulpit butts out from the church. And William Oxley Thompson would go out there and preach on Sunday morning. And he could eyeball the fraternities and sororities and student housing. And he knew who was in front of him and who was not. And so he used his outdoor pulpit in a very outdoor pulpit sort of way and put on his ministerial hat at the time. Mirror Lake, of course, is the whole reason supposedly Ohio State is here. When the trustees went looking for where to place Ohio State, they looked as far as Springfield. They looked down by what is now Greenlawn, around Greenlawn Cemetery. They looked in a number of places, and they kept coming back here because there was a natural water spring. And in fact, people would come from miles around to fill jugs with spring water. One thing Columbus has that we forget about because we're so overbuilt and our sanitation sewers, you know, have a very bad name about them, is how many artesian wells there are that spring up all through Columbus. The brewers used them in the south end to make beer. They did not pull the water out of Scioto. Thank God, right? 19th and North 4th is an old shopping center. Underneath that parking lot is the original Indianola pool, largest pool in the state of Ohio, and it was fed by 3 natural artesian wells. And this was an artesian well. So one of the trustees supposedly dipped a little bucket into the water and drank it and said, "Oh, what good water for a Dutchman." You know, I don't know what that means, except that he didn't fall over and that was good. Sometime about 1930, there was an effort by the part of graduates at Ohio State to actually make a grotto out of it and kind of a rock garden. And that's about when they added the Browning Amphitheater that's over to that side. So let's pick another building over here and kind of walk up this side. There's 2 I'd like to point out to you. Hall, a lot of you probably familiar with it, right? How many of you have been in it? A couple of you. If you've never been in it, you've got to go into it. I'm sorry that I don't believe it has summer hours open today. First of all, the library off to the side there is the picture perfect Harry Potter library. And secondly, it is covered with artwork that was originally given to Orton or to others. And so you've got landscapes of the West. You have everything to do with geology that was done by painters. And these are priceless things, and they're all in that library. And there's a great little guide you can get to walk around with. If you went straight through, then you get to find the beautiful Ohio mastodon that was found in a tar pit in Ohio that's been there for a long time. It's a great museum for little kids, but it's great to wander around on your own. The term humanities usually applies to when the arts and the letters come together. So it's about art and architecture and literature and history and archaeology, and it couldn't be a better place to say this is a building that's sort of like the embodiment of humanities. When Yost and Packard started to build this building, they decided to draw the inspiration of Edward Orton himself. Edward Orton was the first president of the university. He was also the head of the geology department, and he was the head of the state geology department. So he wore a number of hats. But when Packard took his inspiration, what he did was he decided to layer the rock just like you'd find in geological strata. And so the oldest rock in Ohio that was found is down here. And then it goes up and up and up through other periods of time, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, until you get to the very, very top, and those are the dinosaurs. So that's the rise of the dinosaurs are actually the gargoyles on the top.
Oh,
And the building was done for Edward Orton and dedicated by his son, also named Edward Orton, for those of us who are all confused by this. This rock, though, is really just this great gem. There are 2 large erratic rocks that are found in Franklin County from the glaciers. You know, they got rolled and pushed and whatnot. One of them that's larger is the rock, the FRANKEINTON Centennial Rock in Franklinton Park. And it's a giant rock, and it was used for the 1913 centennial of the city. And it's a little hard to find. This one was found in Iuka Ravine, which is where I live. And it's actually was said to be found at 16th and Iuka, but it wasn't. It was found at North 4th and Iuka. And when it was found, of course, only part of it was seen, and Edward Orton had his students start to dig this thing out. And it grows and grows and grows, and finally to the size that it is. And then, now this is a mark of a really good teacher. He convinces his students that they need to drag the rock to here. So put yourself at North 4th, Iuka Ravine, up around there, and imagine this rock grating its way all the way down through here until it lands here as part of the monument to Edward Orton. I think it's just a lovely story. I'm just going to use this as kind of a quick summary about 3 buildings, and then you're free to run off. Okay, first of all, Menden Hall is the same Menden Hall as the Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska. Menden Hall was a physics teacher in Ohio, in the late 19th century, and he was so good, he was a high school teacher and he had no degrees, that Ohio State recruited him to start a physics department. And so he became so nationally known that he wound up going to Japan just after World War I to help set up the seismic earthquake center that Japan and everybody relies on. And so he was really astounding. His only one miscalculation in all of his life was that he thought that Ohio Stadium should never be built larger than 45,000 people because nobody would be there to occupy it. So he was off in those numbers. What people don't know is this building has all been refurnished. In the basement, there is a little 10-inch hole that's so big, and it goes down 300 feet, and it measures all the seismic activity in central Ohio in case we are ever in an earthquake. It is in this building. Page Hall over there, which a lot of you know is the John Glenn School of Public Policy, for a long time was completely gutted as they decided what to do with it and how they were going to trim it out. And what was interesting is it stood there looking like the Brandenburg Gate for a long time, just the facade of it. So if you ever get a chance to walk around the back, you can easily pick out John Glenn's office, because he decided metaphorically and physically he wanted to think out of the box. His office is actually a glass cube that hangs off inside the building. And then downstairs there's this great museum, part of which is dedicated to his own high school teacher in New Concord who inspired him to go into public policy. I mean, just about Long's Bookstore, the old one, you know where it is? Probably will be torn down within the next couple years. It's slated as one of 25 sites with campus partners for redevelopment. That and Hennick's next door to it, which was the old kind of drugstore ballroom where James Thurber hung out with Elliot Nugent and they wrote plays and cut class together and things, is there. But Long's Bookstore started as a family business 1902, Doc Long. His son was born in the building, and everything still exists in that building. They can't get it down. The building is filled with books. The elevator has not been working for 7 years, not inspected, and it's really a rabbit warren of other buildings. So if you get in there at some time, we keep trying to have some kind of an event there, but the insurance costs would probably be too high. But you can wander through above the plate glass windows that face on the High Street side. It's just a stucco, right? But if you were inside of it and went inside, you can see where there were apartments. You can see where there were doors. There's wallpaper, where there was a glass door that said rare books that were all there. And Long's is also a publishing company. So from top to bottom, that building is filled with books still. And if we can figure out a way to get them down and sell them at $10 a bag, we will be very rich indeed. Anyway, we hope to see you next Monday. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
That wraps up today's episode of Columbus Art Walks and Landmark Talks. To find out more about upcoming tours, you can visit columbuslandmarks.org. However, you don't have to wait for a guided tour. You can do it yourself. Columbus Art Walks are self-guided walking maps and audio tours of several districts in Columbus. You can download the maps of Art Walk sites, and when you go to the site, you'll find the Art Walk signs that will give you a phone number of a recorded message that will tell you about what you're seeing. Columbus Art Walks and Landmark Talks is brought to you by Columbus Public Health, the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and by the Ohio Humanities Council, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.